Hi everyone, my name is Emily Harvey, and this is my honors capstone presentation on the great narrative, the evolution of state censorship in Soviet-era museums. This research was done under the direction of Dr. Stephen Harris of the History Department. So my research pertains to my minor in museum studies and my interest in Russian history. So throughout December and January, I conducted book research on Soviet-era museums and came to my thesis and the conclusion that the relationship between the great narrative, censorship, and museums was not stagnant. The Soviet leaders played a large role in defining the censorship and great narrative of their time in office. So when I say great narrative, I mean the museum mission or museum narrative. So this means that because Soviet Union museums were under state control, all museums had the same narrative, even if they were history museums, science museums, or so on. Every time a museum narrative changed, every single museum had to change. So to start, here is my content of what we will be discussing today. And so to begin, we're going to discuss pre-revolution censorship, because to understand Soviet censorship, you have to understand what it was based on. So we're going to begin with Tsar Nicholas I. And with Tsar Nicholas I, his reign became defined as censorship tear. Censorship was very strict and controlled during this time, and you will see that again in the Soviet Union. So when I say censorship tear, I mean that museums were only for the ruling elite. The working class and the serfs were not allowed in, or open hours were restricted to times when they would be at work. There was also an unwritten dress code. So when objects were censored during this time, it really meant that no anti-religion art or objects were allowed. And being Eastern Orthodox, this meant that anything that went against Eastern Orthodoxy was not allowed in their museums. And then we have a change with Tsar Alexander II and the Great Reforms, which he is most famous for. The Great Reforms led to the emancipation of the serfs, but also to a thing called museomania. Museomania describes the rehabilitation, reconstruction, or construction of new museums in the Russian Empire. Most notably, these were constructed in Moscow and some in St. Petersburg. This led to more open hours for the newly freed serfs to come and view art and culture, and also no more unwritten dress codes. The censorship was still pretty much the same. No anti-religious art was allowed in the museums. For Tsar Alexander III, I unfortunately could not find much documentation on what life was like for museums during that time. But then we have Tsar Nicholas II, who reigned up until the revolution of 1917. And he was most similar to Tsar Nicholas I. He was very strict on censorship, and he even added to what had to be censored in museums, to include that no wrongful artistic depictions of the ruling elite could be shown. So that meant no slander against the czars. And again, museums became for the elite, hours were restricted again, and the dress code was reinforced. So, and then we see a change with the revolution of 1917. With the revolution of 1917, we see this concept that there was a freedom from censorship, but this was not true. There were still rules and regulations, but it was not as strict as before. And for Lenin and the rest of the Bolsheviks, this meant that after the triumph of the October Revolution, the cultural and political educational work of the museums became the most important. Museums were to become a highlight of the Soviet Union, and to do that, they had to develop a strong base at the beginning. And so this base became known as the Great Narrative. And the first great narrative of the Soviet Union was called "The Heroic Feat of the People Shall Endure Throughout the Ages." And while this narrative does not stay throughout the Soviet Union, it does have a reemergence during the 1970s and 1980s, but it was really about the workers' struggle during this time. And for censorship, this meant that it was going to be the opposite of the Tsarist regime. There was to be no noble or elite ideals in museums, and religious art was pretty much banned. And instead of doing it through many, many different censorship bureaus, the Soviet Union had one established censorship bureau at the time, and that was called Glavlit. We will see Glavlit through to the end of the Soviet Union, along with an addition of several different KGB offices. We also have something that Lenin established himself besides the state-based museums, and that was called the House Museums for Workers. So when the elite left or were unfortunately killed in the Russian Revolution, their private collections became public property. One example is the Yusupov family in Arkhangelsk. This meant that everything was owned by the people now. And this often led to the Bolsheviks coming in and selling or moving objects to other museums. So nothing was in its rightful place. And this disbursement of objects led to issues later on, especially towards the fall of the Soviet Union, because objects were not where they should have been, and the narrative was never going to be right that way. And these house museums were specifically called proletarian house/palace museums. And Lenin used these to create a different great narrative than what we saw in the state-based museums. And the narrative was to foster an appreciation of art and beauty that the newly freed workers were not used to. This meant that the workers could finally appreciate what they fought for, and that this was all theirs. It was not just owned by one person anymore. And the most prominent house museum of Lenin's type was actually created after his death, and this was actually called the Lenin Museum. The most notable way to describe the Lenin Museum is through the children's book In the Lenin Museum by Sergei Mikhalkov. This book was basically Soviet propaganda, but showcased how the Lenin Museum focused on the workers' struggle and not just Lenin himself. And then we had a change. We had the first big change in the great narrative in the Soviet Union. And this happened when Joseph Stalin took office after Lenin's death. And instead of just changing the great narrative, he actually created a whole new art style to have as his great narrative. And his art style was called socialist realism. Socialist realism is described as depicting reality in its revolutionary development. Artistic depiction must be combined with the task of the ideological transformation and education of the working people in the spirit of socialism. You can see an example of socialist realism in the bottom right corner. And so socialist realism was the first time we start to see the great narrative not focus on the workers' repression and the workers' struggle. It was when we first saw it start to really focus on the Soviet Union and socialism itself. And this will be a trend that happens with the next few leaders of the Soviet Union. So for Stalin, censorship really defined the Stalin era. Despite himself being cruel and restricted, censorship was also cruel and restricted. Everything was regulated, more objects were being dispersed to the wrong museums, and there was also the development of the blind idealization of Lenin and Stalin. And this was also called the cult personality. We will see this start to fade later on in the Soviet Union, but at the time, besides socialist realism, this was all that could be shown pretty much in museums, was depictions of Lenin and Stalin and the greatness they have done for the Soviet Union. Similar to Lenin, Stalin also created a different type of museum, and they were called the Open Air Museum, also known as Musée Zapovedniki. I'm sorry for my pronunciation. Probably the most popular example was the Kremlin complex, and unfortunately it was not open to the public at the time, but citizens could still walk around and get a sense of what life is like in that area, and also see the red imposing brick walls and go, oh my goodness, this is what it is about. And a notable example that was open at the time was the Guriya Mir Mausoleum in the Soviet Republic of Uzbekistan. The Soviet Union, specifically Stalin, used the great narrative of socialist realism, but also combined a little bit of the great narrative of Lenin to showcase the workers' repression that happened at the mausoleum. There was repression during the Tsarist regime, but these people were to be thankful for the Soviet Union and all that it has done for them at the time. Besides being used for the great narrative, it was also used to exploit Islamic rule in Central Asia and legitimize Soviet rule in the area. We then have probably the most controversial or biggest change in the Soviet Union for museums. And this is when Nikita Khrushchev came into office after Stalin's death and established the Kryevedeny method in the Soviet Republic museums. First off, Khrushchev is well known for his thing called the thaw. And the thaw was the undoing of Stalin's cultural practices. This meant that the cult of personality around Stalin really started to fade away and became less important. It is important to note that the Lenin cult of personality stayed until the end of the fall of the Soviet Union. We also see with the thaw, the limitations of censorship really decreased. And we started to see Impressionist and Post-Impressionism art come into exhibitions and museums. It did not last very long. Khrushchev decided he didn't like it and it got censored away. We also see a change in the great narrative to more of what Stalin was focusing on, and that is historicizing the Soviet rather than the Russian national past. Instead of looking before the revolution and to the workers' struggle, Khrushchev wanted to focus on the revolution and on. He didn't want to focus on a workers' struggle anymore. He wanted to focus on how much the Soviet Union has done since then. And through this, he developed the cryovedeni method. This method was established earlier in the Soviet Union, but did not work and wasn't really used until Khrushchev. And this method was used to promote the local culture of the Soviet republics through museums with the intent to stimulate national patriotism. It also was used to develop a stronger appreciation for the socialist motherland and create a stronger communist society. Soviet Republic museums were not allowed to showcase their local culture and what it meant to be, let's say, a Belarusian, instead of just being a republic of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, cryovedeni ultimately failed because Khrushchev and the Soviet government felt the republics were giving too much power and too much freedom, and they were starting to break away from the Soviet Union. With this, and the reason the cryovedeni failed, we see the end of museum freedom underneath Brezhnev in the 1960s. He restored some of the strict censorship laws that Stalin had, and then he also created several KGB offices that joined Glavlit in developing censorship, especially in the Soviet republics. And I could not find a quote of what the great narrative was during the time, but mostly it focused and put an emphasis on the greatness of the Soviet Union and its achievements. This meant scientific advancements, war accomplishments, and Soviet unity. This was also during the Cold War, so scientific advancements really was the big emphasis. Surprisingly enough, during the 1960s, Brezhnev began to face backlash, especially after cryovedeni failed, about the false narratives and misrepresentation of objects in both the main Soviet Union and the Soviet republics. People felt the objects and artworks were not being shown for what they were, and the truth was not being told. And to do something about this, Brezhnev changed in the 1970s. There was a very much still strict censorship, but the cultural institutions began to globalize, and their doors began to open to outside people outside of the Soviet Union. So we see United States citizens and European citizens, especially younger high school and then college students, began to visit the Soviet Union and visit museums and find out really what the Soviet Union is about. Alongside opening their own doors, they also sent exhibitions outside of the Soviet Union, so most popularly to the US and Europe. These exhibitions mainly focused on the revolution of 1917, mostly documentary footage that had not been seen before, and certain objects, but the exhibitions had to go through a strict censorship process before being sent out. I could not find any documentation really on exhibitions that came into the Soviet Union, but they mainly focused on fine and decorative arts, so they would have ended up at places such as the Hermitage. And then we come to the penultimate global narrative that happened. And this narrative was produced by the Ministry of Culture of the USSR, and it is a great combination of all those before it, but it's also very unique. And it reads, "The historical and cultural monuments of the USSR mirror the material and spiritual life of the past generations, the centuries-old history of our homeland, the struggle of the masses of the people for its freedom and independence, the revolutionary movement, and the formation and development of the Soviet socialist state." This great narrative gave museums a little more freedom about what they could show and what they could display the story about. Then, unfortunately, we have the fall of the wall. The fall of the wall happened in 1989, and then we see the dissolvement of the Soviet Union in 1991. Before this, museums were really starting to gain an international pedigree, but then when the Soviet Union fell, museums began to struggle with finding their own great narrative and their own mission statement and telling the whole truth of what happened during the Soviet Union. They were afraid, in a sense, to tell the truth, but it had to be told. So Soviet and Russian scholars urged these museums not to destroy or hide Soviet objects, but to showcase them in a new light. Unfortunately, there had been some destruction already with Soviet monuments and statues, but many of the objects and art actually was preserved. So we see several exhibitions, like one at the Hermitage about the revolution in 1917, and that's a mix of both the Tsarist regime and the Soviet Union in one place. But we also see a lot of exhibitions on artists and objects and artwork that were silenced or hidden during the Soviet Union, and these exhibitions explain why and what was really happening. So in conclusion with my research, Soviet museum practice was not the international standard, and it was very distinct. Consistent great narrative and censorship changes had museums in shambles once the Soviet Union fell, and it also caused Russian museums to kind of lose their international pedigree. And it's taken many years for some of them to gain that back, but many, such as the Hermitage and the Kremlin Armory, are on an international standard now today. And so that was my presentation on the Great Narrative, the evolution of state censorship in the Soviet era museums. Thank you so much.